image on the screen, we can tell, even if we don't recognise precisely what text it is from, that this is a version of the Middle Ages. There's a Viking longship, a castle, a person with an axe, shields, and also it's raining. Now, this is an image, some of you may recognise it, from the media pack for Ubisoft's game Assassin's Creed Valhalla, a game I suspect many of you have played. It's immediately recognisable, not because it recreates a particular historical medieval place or scene or event, but because there are elements that are already familiar to us from popular culture. It's not that there is nothing at all historical referenced in it, but that we recognise the popular versions. This is not an image of a specific medieval Viking longship, for example, but we can still tell, looking at it as part of today's audience, that this is what's represented. So we recognise the popular versions and images of the Middle Ages more than we perhaps would something which is actually a medieval remnant or object. So here in Germany, unlike where I'm from in Australia, there are many traces of historical medieval things to be seen in churches, in castles, in some houses, in bridges, all of these things. But even now, despite these traces of historical buildings, it's the popular versions of the Middle Ages that are perhaps far more common. There's more Game of Thrones than there are 13th century bridges. So popular culture in the 21st century is full of images like these. I'm sure you will recognise some or even all of the popular culture products that they come from. So the Middle Ages, we could say, have never been more popular. We all know them when we see them. So what I want to talk about today is why this is the case, and some ways that we as students and scholars of both the past and the present can think about the process through which our current situation emerged and is maintained. So about how this particular period of the past became such a common part of 21st century popular culture, and why the particular versions of the Middle Ages became a part of popular culture. There are things that these sorts of products tend to have in common that make them recognisable to us as medieval. So I want to begin then by explaining what it is I actually mean by the Middle Ages first, and then by popular and popular culture. So these are both terms that are quite common. Most everyday people would assume that they know what we're talking about. But in academic terms, we can and should be more specific. So I'll start by some brief points about the Middle Ages. So we would usually talk about them as being from around about the year 500 to around about the year 1500. And this is often sort of dated to the fall of Rome, and then up to the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Empire. So a 1,000-year period. Obviously, this is a very long time for an entire continent. So when we talk about the Middle Ages, we're always already summarising, compressing, giving a very reduced view of the complexity of all the things that happened in Europe and also in Scandinavia over 1,000 years. So the idea of the Middle Ages didn't exist. Medieval people thought they were modern. So the idea that there was this period in time between the classical era, which was sort of seen as a golden age, a time of great learning and civilization, and the early modern or Renaissance was really invented in the Renaissance in the 16th century originally by the Italian humanists, who kind of said, okay, well, this period that we've just been through, this 1,000 years, We're not like that. We're much more civilised. It's quite barbaric. We're really better off just sort of forgetting about that as much as possible and looking back to ancient Greece and Rome for our social inspiration, our cultural inspirations, and to ground who we now as modern, newly modern people in the 16th century are. So we still have now, 500 years after the Middle Ages were invented, a concept of them that is heavily influenced by that idea of the early moderns, of the past, the medieval past, being somehow lesser and inherently different. So we think of them as being pre-modern by definition. You can't have the Middle Ages without having something to come after it. We often would think of them as having a feudal system with a king and nobles sort of controlling everything, as pre-industrial, as religious and or superstitious, and a range of other things. We could list what is medieval, or sort of features of medieval society for quite a long time, but I think you'll understand what I'm talking about. And we also have a sense of them as being inherently European, that this was a thing that happened only in Europe during this period, and also a sense that Europe was really quite self-contained, that people didn't move around much, and that there wasn't much sort of trade or influence between Europe and any other part of the world. Now, this is not, to be quite blunt about it, true. So we know that there were many, many connections, some to do with trade, some to do with migration, between different parts of Europe and other parts of the world, into North Africa, just across the Mediterranean, into the Middle East, down the Silk Roads, right into most of the continent of Asia, and of course across the Atlantic into North America with Norse societies. So we're increasingly coming to understand that the Middle Ages were in fact much more global than we have been sort of assuming, or than was what was said about them for a long time. So if this is what we might say about the Middle Ages, what then can we mean by the popular? Well, this is what the French theorist Pierre Bourdieu suggests. And he talks about different domains or fields of culture. So he says there's a domain of high art and literature, and a domain of scholarship and academia and education. And he says a popular domain, which is open to mass audiences and necessarily caught up in the logic of the marketplace, conscious of its viewers or readers and determined to please them. It uses the language of industry and production and values convention, and has a potential, immediate, broad-based distribution. So this is what he suggests it means to be popular. And we could say here, well, it's open to mass audiences. So a lot of people, at least potentially, have access to something that's popular. Popular products aim to please those viewers, that particular audience. So it's to do with whether they like things. And also very invested in commercial value, so in being able to sell a product. If you think about it, it seems quite straightforward. People are prepared to buy something or to pay to watch something, for example, because they enjoy it. So popular is to do with lots of people selling things and the technologies that enable those things to happen. But popular culture also plays a part in informing people's dispositions to the world and to each other. And what this means by dispositions, it means how people are inclined to think about others. So popular culture is one of the ways that we learn about the world other than through our own personal experience. So it tells us about, or we learn from it, even though we perhaps think of it as being just entertainment, we learn from it what other people are like, or perhaps, as I'm talking about today, what the past was like. So I have certainly learnt things about history from reading historical fiction that I would never have learnt at school, for example. Some of them are true, others perhaps not so much. And we'll come to this a little bit later. So when we talk about the Middle Ages in popular culture, when we talk about things like Assassin's Creed Valhalla or Game of Thrones, The Witcher, some of these kinds of texts that we would say, oh yes, that's medieval, and perhaps even that's authentically medieval. What we're talking about is not actually the Middle Ages, the historical period, or anything that specific that happened in it at all. What we're talking about is what is often termed medievalism. So medievalism refers to the art, literature, scholarship, avocational pastimes, so fun things people do, like recreation societies, and sundry forms of education and culture that turn to the Middle Ages for their subject matter or inspiration, and in doing so explicitly or implicitly, by comparison or by contrast, comment on the artist's contemporary socio-cultural milieu. So what we can say then is that medievalism is a term that describes many things. So it might describe something that really does seek to recreate or adapt something that remains from the medieval period. So we might think about here, say, the operas of Richard Wagner, for example, that adapted for the period in which he wrote them, original material that was originally medieval and that are, of course, now in the present performed as also being medievalism. But we can also think about things like Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings or Assassin's Creed Valhalla as medievalism, even though what they are inspired by is a much more general and non-specific sense of medievalness. You know, most of what happens in Game of Thrones is not actually inspired by a specific medieval event or person or thing, for example. Those are drawn in as part of the world that George Martin imagines, but that world of Westeros itself is much more sort of vaguely medieval, much less connected to something that is really specifically historical than other kinds of texts. But we can think about all of these ways of relating to and reimagining the past for our own purposes now as medievalism. Excuse me. So what tends to happen in medievalism, and this is more trends than a sort of definitive statement about all medievalism, so this is common, is that we have a sense of what has been termed the banal Middle Ages. Now, banal means sort of everyday or uninteresting, something that you don't really notice or think about. It's just kind of there, a bit like brushing your teeth in the morning or the fact that the train is late. So the ways that we tend to assume the Middle Ages were, and specifically the European Middle Ages, so this is going back to a sort of long-established but not necessarily accurate idea, is that it is a space and time of whites only. So where really there were only white people in Europe, and that these were racially, culturally and socially pure. That the Middle Ages are part of the heritage of Western nations in some sort of vague way that we don't often really think about very explicitly. Now, this is also true in Australia, even though white people only came there a little over 200 years ago. We think of the Middle Ages as being somehow part of where Australia comes from, often around particular focus points. So our legal system perhaps is often said to, oh, well, that begins with Magna Carta. That was an important document for the English legal system in the 13th century. When you start looking, it's really not, but that's how it's often talked about sometimes in political discourse or just kind of assumed to be. We also think about the Middle Ages as having a rigid social structure. So there were peasants and priests and lords and kings, and that was about it. And you couldn't really move from one position in this class structure to another. And we also tend to think about them as inherently violent. And I sort of assume that all of you have watched at least some Game of Thrones or The Witcher or something like this, where violence is just part of the everyday life of the people in these texts. These are, as I said, the banal, the kind of everyday Middle Ages, the way that we just assume they were like. So in popular culture, what tends to happen is that if a text departs from these, so for example, if it has characters of colour in it, there has to be an explanation. And whether people find that explanation sufficient for them or not often shapes how they respond to the text. So in popular culture, what we have is these particular ideas of the Middle Ages which can be departed from, but requires some kind of explanation or becomes a thing that people really notice, not this kind of background, banal, unnoticeable, assumed European Middle Ages. So in popular culture, we can say, drawing some of these threads together, that a text like Game of Thrones or The Witcher is less interested in accurate or authentic reproductions of history than they are in the concerns of the present. And so that means that really that when people are making Game of Thrones, a video game, a television show that's medievalist, they might look to the past for some inspiration, but the thing that matters most to them is what's happening now, what will make their product entertaining or interesting or sell to a mass audience, to many people. So they're much more invested in the concerns of the present, in what their audience now is interested in, than they are in teaching them some historical fact about the past. And the way that they get access to that past, this is both producers and us as audience members, is through intermediate reimaginings of it. So we're always influenced in the present by what people in the past thought about the Middle Ages. So there are layers of centuries that we work through. The 19th century, I think here in Germany as well as in England and Australia, were very concerned with the Middle Ages, very interested in the medieval period, and had their own ideas about what it was like, many of which have been shown to be not historically accurate, but those ideas still influence what we still think of now as the Middle Ages, even if they're not correct. So all reimaginings of the Middle Ages are influenced by the cultural context in which they're produced, so by the present, and by earlier eras, versions of the Middle Ages. And we can see this. This is a long quote. I won't read it out. I hope you can see it reasonably clearly. So this is a quote from George Martin when the Game of Thrones TV show was first being made. And in it he talks about, I will read it out, at least some of it, how most of the fantasy novels, so remembering that Game of Thrones, of course, was novels before it was a show, really what he's saying here is that the way his novels were, the way he wrote them in the late 1990s, were responding to what he thought was wrong with the way that the Middle Ages were then represented in fantasy fiction. So he says a lot of fantasy of Tolkien imitators has a quasi-medieval setting. So it's like the Disneyland Middle Ages. You know, they've got tassels and they've got lords and stuff, but they don't really seem to grasp what it was like in the Middle Ages. And then he contrasts this with historical fiction, which he says was grittier and gave you a real sense of what it was like to live in castles or be in battles with the swords or so on. And he says, what I want to do is combine some of the realism of historical fiction with some of the appeal of fantasy, the magic and the wonder that the best fantasy has. And so what's happening here is that he is influenced by his own current moment, but also by earlier ideas of what the Middle Ages are like. You know, Game of Thrones in the books and also in the show doesn't come just from what George Martin thinks about the Middle Ages. That's been filtered through and is a response to specifically what was going on in fantasy literature when he was writing. And as these images show, what comes out in Game of Thrones is really quite different to the Disneyland Middle Ages. So he's being influenced not just by copying an idea that already existed, but in kind of rebelling against it, responding to it negatively and saying, well, that's not really it. Okay, so we can say then that popular culture is a space where particular ideas about the Middle Ages are spread through commercial products. The dominant logic then is what aspects of the medieval will sell to an audience, not how can we educate them truthfully about history. But we still learn things about the past, some factual, some general, and some just simply not true, through popular culture. So I want to spend a little bit of time digging into what it is popular culture actually teaches us about the Middle Ages, or what it tells us about the Middle Ages if we don't want to think about teaching too much in our entertainment. So what I'm going to do then is talk specifically about video games. And delve a little bit into the platform Steam. Does anyone play on Steam? I'm seeing a few hands. Great, okay, so some of you at least are familiar with this platform. We're going to dig into a little bit what video games are said to be medieval on this platform. Some of them you'll recognise, I think, or I suspect. Some of them perhaps not. Has anyone played any of the Crusader Kings 3 or Assassin's Creed Valhalla? Yeah, okay, so some of you at least are familiar with these texts, the kinds of things that I'm going to be talking about. Now those two are really big popular games, AAA productions aimed at a really mass audience and quite successful. So the ideas of the medieval that are embedded in these games have spread very widely around the globe. Pentiment is one that is also a AAA product, but not aimed at quite such a big audience, and is a little bit less conventional. And if we have time, I'll talk about it a little further. Okay, so I want to begin then by just having a look at what's medieval on Steam. So Steam is, it's an online platform for games where it doesn't have every game that was ever made, but it has a lot. At least in the tens of thousands. And so it's a good kind of snapshot of what popular culture is like. And this is why we're working with it. And these are all from maybe a month or two ago when I did this work and took these screenshots. So they would have changed slightly if you went and replicated what I've done here. So to start out with, what we have on this list, which I hope you can see at least some of, is a keyword search just for medieval, and it gives us 6,242 games. And this screenshot, if you can see the list, shows how it functions. So basically what's happened is that the platform has just popped up games that have medieval in the title first. So you might recognise a title or two if you're a gamer, but it's fair to say that these are not the high-profile medievalist games like Crusader Kings 3 or games like this. But Steam also has what they call user-defined tags, which works differently. So in the user-defined tags, players can tag as medieval or whatever else they think is appropriate or important about a game. And so when we search these, we get what I think is actually a much more interesting way of thinking about what is popularly thought of as medieval, because it is about players sharing knowledge with each other, rather than this list, which is more about, okay, well, how important is this keyword in the words that have been entered to do with this game, which is quite a different way of thinking about it. Okay, so on this slide, we have instead the games that come up when we ask for, well, what games have users, players, said are medieval? And here we can see some more well-known titles. Crusader Kings 3 is up there, The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt is up there, Age of Empires, some really big games. But what we get here is, I need to look closely, 3,239 games popping up as being tagged by users as medieval. So roughly half of the games that use the word medieval to describe them are actually recognised by players as medieval enough to be called that. So it's interesting to me that users have tagged just about 50% of games that came up in the keyword search. So there's a substantial body of games that are not considered medieval by the playing public, or at least not significantly enough to be labelled that way, to be worth their time saying, oh yes, this is medieval. People who are interested in something medieval might want to play this game. So it's beyond the time we have in this lecture to sort of explore the gap in depth, but I do want to offer one example of a game that I think, as an academic who spends a lot of time thinking about what's medieval in popular culture, that hasn't been tagged as medieval by players on Steam. And this is the game Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. Does anybody know this one? Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, great. So the game maker's description says it's set in the Viking Age. Well, there's a medieval keyword. A broken Celtic warrior embarks on a haunting vision quest into Viking hell to fight for the soul of her dead lover. Look, it's not all that happens in the game, but there is absolutely some keywords that would say to you there, oh, it's medieval, it's got Vikings in it, right? And warriors. So a couple of people who have played it, would you say it was medieval? I'm seeing perhaps a maybe, maybe not. Why not? What doesn't say medieval about this to you? Please.
There's too much fantasy.
Okay. Too much fantasy, all right. Anything else? Just call out, sorry, I can't see you over there.
Yeah, more psychological story that takes place in the person's mind and not in the world.
Okay. So too psychological, too much inside somebody's head to be medieval, yeah? Okay, so the person's mind rather than... Okay, so, but it looks you would say it looked fairly medieval? Okay. Okay, does it have things, I haven't played the whole thing, does it have some of those things that are kind of conventionally medieval? So it mentions Vikings. Do you see anybody that looks like a Viking? Probably not that often, because none of you have said yes, absolutely. Castles? Probably no cathedrals if it's Viking hell. Okay, so some of the things, even though there's perhaps a medievalist aesthetic, a kind of looks like it might be medieval, we're going to come back to this idea. It also doesn't have some of those kind of conventional, oh yes, this is medieval, it's Viking hell, but there's perhaps no Vikings, there's no castles, there's no cathedrals, no knights. So what players, I suspect, are kind of not finding there are the things that say, oh, this is medieval. And that might be a range of things. Okay, so thank you for your input, those of you who have played it. Obviously, it is also a popular game. Okay, so we'll come back to what we have on Steam, because it also allows you, as if you can see down the side, it allows you to narrow your search down. Okay, and what we have here is, what exactly, okay, this is our list of user tagged games as medieval. So this figure in the low 3000s compares to about 700 user tags for games that are set in World War II. Another popular game period, about 100 for Rome, so another historical period that video games might be in, and about 1,800 just for historical video games. So obviously this is not an exhaustive list of periods in which games could be or are set, but the comparison clearly highlights how many medieval games there are and their significant presence in this popular video game market. So medievalist games are popular. People want to play them, so they keep getting made. So game producers, studios keep making medievalist games because people want to keep playing them. So this means that there is a lot of them, but also even when we're talking about, you know, small studios and independent games, they're commercial in that they're trying to sell a product to an audience. So they're trying to give people what they want, not, with very few exceptions, trying to teach them something accurate about the Middle Ages. It's not that this is a bad thing, it's just not what's happening. Okay, so we can move on to narrow things down a little here. When we say, okay, I want to look at games that are tagged as both medieval and fantasy, what we come up with is 2,391 of the games that are tagged as medieval are also said to be fantasy. And this is in comparison to 5 out of 700 World War II games that are tagged fantasy. So what we have here is a really high crossover between fantasy games and games that are tagged as medieval. And what this tells us is a couple of things. One, well, this is not particularly surprising because so much of fantasy as a genre is inspired through perhaps Tolkien and through then George Martin and many other things by the Middle Ages. So when you think about fantasy, often what you're thinking about is medievalism. Okay, so we're seeing that reflected here. But it's also interesting because it's telling us that in the popular imagination, at least of game players who use Steam, medieval does not necessarily mean historical. That there is a kind of conceptual detachment between those two things. When you look at medieval games that are tagged as medieval and also as historical, there are about 240. So far fewer medieval games are also tagged as historical than are tagged as fantasy. And there are some that are not tagged as either fantasy or historical. So what we can say then is that medieval in popular culture does not always mean historical, and it can be completely detached from even the idea of history, which I think is not always as true for other historical periods. So if we think about the classical period, and I don't have the numbers here, but I did kind of do the same thing, we really don't see that same kind of strong fantasy presence in classical period or more modern periods either. Okay, so perhaps not surprisingly, again, most games on Steam that are tagged as medieval are not tagged as educational. This doesn't mean we don't learn anything from them, but it means that, well, this is really not what players are looking for, not what producers are, not the way that they're framing their games. So only 22 medieval games are also tagged as education. And here are some of them. So the breadth of what is considered to be educational and medieval is interesting, if somewhat confronting to those of us who do not consider the Roman Empire to be medieval, because we have in there, in case you can't see it, the top one is Castrum Novum VR, Life in a Roman Colony. So it's not totally clear to me how that one got tagged as medieval, but it was. But it's certainly a game that is, or an offering that is designed to be educational. And there are other ones like this. So there are some walkthroughs, I'm not sure if you can read it there, of Guildford Castle in virtual reality. So we're also seeing in Steam that people, organisations that want to create an educational experience based in a game platform are also using Steam as a method to spread this, to disseminate this, to try and get people to engage. But you really have to go looking to find it. When you go looking for a medieval game, the Guildford Castle virtual reality is a long way down through those thousands of games that are listed. Okay, so you probably wouldn't think of this as a popular game or as a popular product in the whole range of medievalist offerings on Steam, because it's not really aimed at that. They're not trying to get a mass audience, they're just trying to make it available for people who are interested. And two, because it hasn't had one. And three, because their aim here actually is to educate, not to entertain. I think they're probably trying to do a bit of both, but the main logic of an offering like Guildford Castle virtual reality is you will learn something by engaging with this digital text, as opposed to Witcher 3 The Wild Hunt, which is you will really like engaging with this digital text, and you'll perhaps tell your friends about it, and they might buy it too. Okay, so there are very different logics going on there. One is aiming to do something that the other is not. Okay. So, if we move on from the educational, I'm going to keep calling them games. What we can also see in these ones, in case you can't make it out, these are golf games that are tagged as medieval. So something that becomes evident quite quickly when you explore the various groups of tags that on Steam is that almost anything from World War I to golf can be co-tagged with medieval. And here are the medieval golf games. Now, this is perhaps, again, not so surprising when we think about just how banal, how everyday medievalism is in contemporary culture. And if you've ever played mini golf, I have small children, so I have fairly recently, it's quite common for there to be some kind of toy castle in the course. This is one of the sort of classics of mini golf. So it's perhaps, again, not so surprising there. But taken in comparison with the absence of similar games themed to other periods, so classical Rome and the world wars, for example, don't have golf games tagged to them. So this suggests what we might call an oversaturation of medievalism. That has been this idea, this sort of concept or vague sense of the medieval has been used in such a variety of ways, has become so popular, so widespread, that it becomes really just an aesthetic, a look, not a substance. And I think this kind of connects with what you were saying about the optics of Hellblade, that there's a particular look that we can kind of recognise and say, oh yeah, that might be a bit medieval. So there's a medievalist aesthetic that has, as we can see in these golf games, nothing to do with the historical Middle Ages at all. So these games are examples of many that can be called rebranded in the sense that a medievalist layer has been laid over an existing game type without changing the game in anything but appearance. These are just digital mini golf games with a kind of medieval skin, or I mean, it's not a mod, but that kind of thing. It's just changed the look. And this is the sort of thing that happens with, I don't know, board games like Monopoly quite frequently. Similar things might happen in more complex game genres as well. So it's not just golf. You can see here are some flight simulators that are also tagged as medieval. None of which I would say was particularly historical. Mostly they feature dragons. One of them seems to feature some military ships there as well. So what we have in these games is really games that nobody's choosing to play these games because they are historically medieval in any way. Nobody thinks this. Rather, the game type is the point. You want to play a flight simulator, you want to play mini golf, but with the addition of the popular medievalist aesthetic, that might create a particular niche for players. So this medievalism is laid over it to create an additional layer of pleasure for players who have that particular taste. So thinking about these as medievalist or medieval certainly seems a bit ridiculous in some ways. There's no past to engage with as heritage or history for the player here. What I would suggest instead is that the medieval tagged games like these golf games, flight simulators, there are many others, work to create and maintain a particular relationship between the past and the player in the present. So players are taught that the medieval is something that you can do anything with. It's available for their pleasure, their entertainment in the contemporary moment. They're taught that it's not really, or this sort of gives an idea that it's actually not really historical, and that anything that may have happened doesn't really matter. There's a dominant aesthetic, I would say, of probably a gritty medieval, dirty and dark, like Game of Thrones perhaps, but it's common rather than inevitable. As you can see from some of the thumbnails up here, some of them are dark and dirty, certainly the one with the ships is, and Dragon's Princess down second from the bottom, but others are much more colourful, and perhaps even almost sort of cartoonish or a bit of manga in there perhaps. So this kind of aesthetic of gritty medievalism, the dark, the dirt, the rain that I talked about right at the beginning. This is one thing we recognise as medieval, but we can also recognise as medieval things that don't have that. And I suspect I think that's largely to do with those kinds of icons of the historical period, the castle, the knight, perhaps the priest, the cathedral, these kinds of things. Okay. So what we have in these games is examples that have a popular look and feel of being medieval, some through the gritty darkness, some through particular kind of icons of the world. And this is sort of the way that these games work is comparable, although perhaps not quite identical, to a medieval setting in, say, a popular fiction novel, like romance or crime, sometimes even fantasy. So these kinds of novels tend to be just quite conventional, but just happen to have a medieval setting. So a crime novel is a crime novel, whether it's set in the present or in the past. There are certainly kind of noir crime novels set in the Middle Ages. There are any kind of police procedurals, even though they didn't have police in the Middle Ages. There are still books that kind of have that structure and that setting. So what we can tell from popular culture is that there's you can kind of project the Middle Ages over almost anything if you do it in a way that appeals to what people in the present can recognise as that kind of detached from history and medievalism. Okay, so the different categories for themes, mods and features also reveal tags that gives insight into both the dominant habits and undercurrents in what is recognised as medieval. So about 106, so 3% of medieval games are tagged as having a female protagonist. Now, there are more where playing as a female character is possible. So the 3 Dragon Age games, for example, are not tagged in this list, but you can play as a female protagonist. This very small number, just 3%, reflects an assumed central masculinity in both games generally. So there's no male protagonist tag, it's just kind of assumed that it's a male protagonist unless somebody's told you otherwise. But also in medievalism. So we tend to think about the medieval as being a period where men did things and women looked after children, perhaps, but were very much in the background. So the 2 games that are part of big franchises up on the screen here, so Kingdom Come Deliverance, A Woman's Lot, and Thronebreaker, The Witcher Tales, are add-ons to major male-centric games that were critiqued for lacking female representation, including, but not only, the ability to play as a female character. Okay, so there is a very sort of strong sense that medievalist means you're going to be playing as a male character, but also this is partly because we have a kind of conventional assumption, or there is a conventional assumption that that's what the Middle Ages were like. Even though historically we know this is not true. There weren't 97% men and 3% women in the Middle Ages. This is the impression that you might get from playing medieval games, and it reinforces an idea that is not accurate but is kind of widely held anyway. So I mentioned before at the beginning that popular culture shapes our dispositions, our beliefs about the world, our attitudes to each other and so on. And in this percentage of female protagonists, we can see a way that popular culture can influence ideas that relate to ideology and to politics. So it's very common for conservative politicians and other particularly conservative people to make reference to the Middle Ages as a natural time when women and men had particular roles and stuck to them. So men fought and did things in this idea, and women had babies, is the sort of simple version. But popular culture medievalism, even those that are completely detached from historical material, help make this idea believable, because what we can see and play is often like this, 97% of the time, apparently. Now, partly this is because video games tend not to show the aspects of real medieval societies that were not about violence and fighting and gaining political power. So most medievalist games, particularly the well-known ones, are very much focused on fighting, battles, and in some genres like real-time or like strategy games like Crusader Kings 3, about building political power by fighting. So these are things that historically mostly men did, although there were, of course, female rulers who also sought to gain political power. But women in the Middle Ages were not often knights or other kinds of warriors, but they also often had very active professional and public lives. not just raising children, but these are their kinds of lives are not the things that we typically see in video games, particularly not those aimed at really mass audiences where in a medieval game, as I said, mostly you fight things, or in most medieval games you fight things, you can't really avoid it. So this kind of active life that women had in the Middle Ages is not something that's widely known or made popular through video gaming, even though it's one of the major ways that medievalism is popularised. It's a very narrow perspective that is popularised, spread through video games, and I would say also through most television shows and this kind of thing. Okay, so even fewer games on Steam are tagged as having LGBTQ+ content. And this demonstrates something like what the American theorist Adrienne Rich terms compulsory heterosexuality. It's really hard to find a medievalist game where you don't have to be heterosexual. In some, again, like the Dragon Age franchise, it's not compulsory, you can make other choices. And that's probably the best known medievalist game where that's possible. So again, there is an idea that gender variation and homosexuality are modern inventions that were strictly banned by the church during the Middle Ages. So medieval sexualities were different to modern ones, so we can't just apply all the same labels without being, at least in some ways, anachronistic, wrong in time, so kind of projecting something that's modern backwards. But there is increasing evidence to show that medieval sexuality was a lot more complex and less heterosexual than the popular view depicted in medievalist games like these might suggest. So again, what we're seeing in popular culture is this kind of very narrow and often quite conservative projection of the Middle Ages that is really detached from historical fact and historical complexity. You know, it's kind of blows your mind when you think, oh, if we're talking about an entire continent for 1,000 years, how can you just say that, oh, well, it was all like this in this one particular way? It just wasn't. All right, so in Steam, there is no tag for racial or ethnic diversity for BIPOC or anything similar that would indicate medievalist games that break the habit of whiteness associated with popular, banal medievalism that I talked about before. Nonetheless, they do exist. So Pentiment, one of the games I mentioned earlier, for example, is set in Eastern Europe, right at the end of the Middle Ages, so as the Reformation was beginning, and it features an Ethiopian non-player character, so an Ethiopian monk who is in this monastery and talks about the fact that this is where he's from. Historically, not at all questionable, quite accurate. It's there, but there's no way of knowing that it's there unless you play the game, right? There's no user tag that can tell you about this. Other examples, Age of Empire includes maps, so spaces you can play that are part of Asia, Central America and other parts of the globe outside Europe. And you can play in that game historical peoples that were dominant in those areas. So it's kind of shifting. It's a game that says it's medieval, but it shifts where the medieval could be. It takes a much more global perspective than many games. So there is some recognition in games, including in major games from major studios, that medieval doesn't necessarily just mean white people in Europe, but there's no clear articulation of this or a way to track it through the user-generated tags. Okay, How much longer do I have? 25 minutes, okay. In that case, we're going to talk a little about Pentiment fairly quickly. I'm going to see if I can get this to play. It's so not going to play. Okay, bear with me just a moment. Nope, okay. Well, in that case, I'll just tell you about it briefly. So as I said, it's a game that's set in the Reformation, so right at the end of the medieval period. You play as Andreas, who is a manuscript illustrator who's gone to this village because he's been commissioned to illustrate a manuscript for a local lord. So while he's there, the Lord turns up and argues about theology with the local monks, but then a murder occurs, and you as the player must uncover clues and eventually tell the monks of the abbey and the townspeople who they think, or who you think was responsible. So in this sense, it's a very familiar narrative to anybody who's ever read crime fiction novels or crime fiction novels set in the Middle Ages. It's essentially a detective story with a medieval setting. But it also does some interesting things that are not always typical of medievalist video games. Okay, so it is a point-and-click adventure. Sorry, I'll go back into full screen. Okay, so there's no puzzles, there's no combat. So in this way, again, it's atypical of a medievalist text. It is, however, or a medievalist game. It is, however, quite violent. So there's a murder, there's a riot among the villagers. These sorts of things happen. So it's, even though you as the player are not fighting things, it's still a very violent, or it's still quite a violent, there's a lot of violence in it. Okay. So it also has something which is, I think, increasingly common. So depending on the player's choices at multiple places in the game, different things happen. So your choices actually matter, and the narrative changes. So depending on what you as the player decide about your character's background, for example, it depends on how you interact with non-player characters. And it also changes depending on who you say was the murderer. You're never actually told. Okay, so you don't know who did it. It's all about piecing these, sort of being the detective yourself. Okay, so this is something like what it looks like. And we can tell even just by seeing it that this is probably a medieval setting. Okay, there's the kind of, that style, even though it's not a gritty kind of dark thing. You can tell perhaps from the clothes and from the style of the drawing that this is potentially a medievalist setting. And what we have here is your player character, Andreas, talking to the local lord, explaining who he is and his background. So in this discussion, they're talking about his education specialisation. So he was at university with Martin Luther, would you believe? And there are different narrative threads to pursue that sort of follow on from this. Now, the game is not tagged as educational by users, but it does work in interesting ways with historical material, even though it's set in a made-up village and monastery and doesn't feature any actual historical people except with a passing mention. So Martin Luther doesn't turn up in the game, for example. So at some points in the game there's this glossary that's set around it in the style of a medieval book. And this can be accessed at numerous points in the dialogue, such as the one on screen. And there are historical facts about different places, different people, these kinds of things. Now, these are optional for the player to explore if they wish to. So you can, if you don't know what a particular town was or these sorts of things, you can find out if you wish, but you don't have to. And you can play the game very successfully without ever using the glossary if you want to. But there are also other historical information that's embedded into the game and that affects the gameplay based on those decisions I was talking about. So quite early on, you have to make this decision about what Andreas, your character, what his education specialisation was. And you can see this happening in the slide. So the two characters discuss basic facts relating to medieval education. And in this one, I've chosen to say that Andreas learned rhetoric. And so in this version of the game where I said he's learned rhetoric, his ways of speaking to characters around him and the local townspeople are different from if you say that he learnt something else. Okay, so this sort of historical material in some ways sort of functions to make it seem historical, make the game seem really historical, but it's woven into the game as more than just a kind of surface thing. So the players' interactions and agencies, the choices they must make, are linked to this historical material in quite tangible ways. So they're meaningful in the game narrative and the branching options that result from the various discussions. And this means, I would suggest, that Pentiment kind of has potential to create a sense of not just learning little facts about the Middle Ages, but a kind of historical empathy, because it increases an historical knowledge and understanding of the context in which your player character lived. So the player acts as an agent, a person who influences events in a recreated past, learning not just facts about medieval rhetoric, as we might see here, but also learning how the digital historical world functions. And that includes some of the kind of social and cultural relationships and structures of the medieval world of this period. Now, I don't suggest that Pentiment is a perfect recreation of the medieval past. The genre features of medieval crime narratives are certainly part of the game, as I mentioned. However, the sense of a day-to-day experience of a medievalist world in the game is significant, in part because it's so different from what you typically get in a medievalist game. So Pentiment, with its character-focused narrative that develops over only a few days, offers a much more human experience, or a much more historical human experience than a typical medievalist game. Look, it's also a fun game to play. One reason that I would say it is a popular medievalism, even though it's perhaps not as well known or as widely played as something like Crusader Kings 3. So to me this is important because it's fun, it can be part of that process of popularising. Okay, so it can be part of that process of spreading a particular or ideas, knowledge about the Middle Ages in the popular culture space, because we want to play games that entertain us, right? And this is one where there are fairly reasonable amounts of historical material set within a way that is still entertaining. Okay, so I will just go back and draw together some of my threads in talking about what I've been saying about the popular Middle Ages. Okay, so first, what we're talking about when we talk about popular culture is not in fact medieval, even though that's what the Steam tag said, but medievalism. It's always a world that has been recreated, an historical or not very historical world that has been recreated in the present in which a text was created. So there are medievalisms, recreation, reimagining, references, sometimes to specific historical material, but sometimes just to an aesthetic or a non-specific, vague kind of, well, that's really what the Middle Ages was like. There are many stories that could be told through medievalism, but the dominant ones in popular culture are linked to the sort of banal medievalisms that are so widely spread that we often don't even notice them. And these are things like most characters are white, mostly it's set in Europe, and most 97% of protagonists are male. We can also say that that popular culture medievalisms are shaped by not just previous centuries, although I guess fantasy of the 20th century is now from a previous century, but of previous eras, of other medievalisms that exist out there, as well as by some historical fact that an author or a game producer might have encountered some other way. We can also argue that because of this, they tell us more about the present than about what the past was really like, because they are so detached from that past. And because in popular culture, what sells is what people want. Now, this does not mean that a popular culture medievalism has no value, or that it is worth less than education about the Middle Ages. It just means that it's different and that we need to be aware of those differences and think about what we're learning when we encounter these texts as students and as scholars of the Middle Ages, but also of the present. Thank you.